Jirachi gave Rayquaza Mega Evolution. In the myths regarding Jirachi, it is said that it only awakens for 7 days every 1,000 years. During this week-long period, it is able to grant any wish to people who ask it. Now, what happened thousands of years ago? Another fight between Groudon and Kyogre. This fight is implied to have been much worse than the one we see in modern times. So imagine you're an ancient Hoennian witnessing a battle that's destroying your entire home region. You hear that a powerful Pokemon awoke with the ability to grant any wish. You seek out this Pokemon, and upon finding Jirachi, you make one wish: stop Groudon and Kyogre. Of course, as with any self-respecting wish granter, it is done in a roundabout way. It grants the wish by giving the historical mediator of the Groudon-Kyogre fight, Rayquaza, the ultimate power. It gave Rayquaza Mega Evolution, and furthermore, it allowed it to Mega Evolve without the use of a Mega Stone or bond with a human. With this, Rayquaza became the most powerful Pokemon on the planet, easily being able to stop the fight between Groudon and Kyogre. With Mega Rayquaza not needing the same requirements as other Pokemon, it makes sense that it would have gotten its Mega in a special way, so making it the result of Jirachi granting a wish makes sense. Maybe it was even Rayquaza who made the wish to Jirachi, who knows. Pokemon Pink. In 1998, Pokemon Yellow, a special edition of the Gen 1 games, was released. While this was meant to be a standalone game based on the anime, is it possible that this was actually meant to be one of two? Well, actually it was. In some data mined source code, a line refers to two counterparts, a yellow package and a pink package. This is rather interesting. Pikachu is not just the mascot of the series, but also integral to the anime in a way no other Pokemon is. You can't just swap out Pikachu for another Pokemon and expect it to work with the retelling of the anime. I guess that's why the game was scrapped. But who is this mysterious pink Pokemon? Well, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu is essentially a remake of Pokemon Yellow, and it has a counterpart, Pokemon Let's Go Eevee. Eevee is the only Pokemon that could reach mascot status similar to Pikachu. However, it's not likely that a brown-colored Pokemon would be the mascot for Pokemon Pink. Another candidate is Jigglypuff. Though never a mascot, it was still very popular due to the anime having a unique personality that could fit a similar role to how Pikachu was used in Yellow. However, the most likely candidate is the Pokemon that was actually initially supposed to be the mascot, Clefairy. Clefairy was slated to be the face of Pokemon. However, they believed that the Pokemon's pink coloration and fairy inspiration made it too girly, which was a no-no for marketing since they wanted to appeal more to boys, who were considered the main market for video games back in the 90s. And so the mascot was changed to Pikachu, a more gender-neutral design that could be cute and cool at the same time. So yes, it's likely a Pokemon Pink revolving around Clefairy was in the works at Game Freak. It's a shame that we never got a Pokemon Let's Go Clefairy, as it would have been a great callback to the scrapped Pokemon Pink, but Eevee had lapped it in popularity at that point, so it was the better choice. Clefairy wasn't forgotten about entirely though. People noticed that in the intro of the game, Oak had 3 Pokeballs. One contained Pikachu, the other Eevee, but what was in the third Pokeball? Some speculated that it contained Clefairy, and it's likely that they were right, as in the Pokemon fan clubhouse in the game, you can see 3 plushies: Pikachu, Eevee, and Clefairy. Water Starter Warfare. While the Fire Starter Zodiac theory is the most popular of the starter connection theories, there are others regarding the grass and water starters. This theory states that the water starters are all based on different eras and types of warfare and soldiers. Blastoise, of course, is obviously based on artillery and tank warfare. Feraligatr represents prehistoric savage warfare, especially if you consider Croconaws' caveman motifs. Swampert represents Greco-Roman warfare. The frills on their body resemble the crests on classical-era Mediterranean helmets, and Hoenn does take some inspiration from the Mediterranean as a whole. Empoleon, of course, is based on the Napoleonic era of warfare and could represent military commanders and strategists. Samurott is obviously a samurai, while Greninja is obviously a ninja. Inteleon is a sniper, and Quaquaval could be some sort of ceremonial guard. Of course, this theory is a bit of a stretch for a few of these examples, like Feraligatr, Swampert, and Quaquaval, and it didn't even touch on Primarina, since there's no way it fits this theory. Any attempted explanations I saw online were absolutely ridiculous. But a lot of them do surprisingly fit this theme, so I don't think the person who formed this theory was completely insane. Grass Starter Extinct Animals. Rounding out the starter trio, this theory states that grass starters are based on extinct animals, and to its credit, it's by far the strongest out of the three theories. Venusaur could be based on the Beelzebufo, an extinct species of toad, and it also has some dinosaur inspiration. Meganium and Subtile are both based on dinosaurs. Torterra seems to be based on the Meolanidae, an extinct species of large tortoises that had spiked heads and tails. Superior could be based on the Titanoboa, an extinct species of massive snakes. Chestnut is pretty clearly based on a Glyptodon, while Decidui is based on the stilt owl, a species of owl that used to live in Hawaii before dying out. Rillaboom could be based on the extinct giant ape, Gigantopithecus. Miascarada is almost certainly based on the Iberian lynx, a species of wild cat that lives in Spain. While its animal is not extinct, it almost reached that point as it's an endangered species. In fact, in 2002, only 94 existed on the entire planet. So even though it's still alive, I think it's close enough to be counted for this list. But yeah, this is a pretty solid theory overall. The only objection is that some of the inspirations are vague. For example, Superior and Rillaboom could just be a regular snake and gorilla, rather than an extinct version. But other than that, I think this theory is very strong. Giant Dragonite is Dynamax. Season 1 Episode 13 of the anime Mystery at the Lighthouse infamously featured a massive Dragonite. While initially just meant to be a one-off anomaly, retroactively it could be a Dynamax Pokemon. The only thing missing are the three little clouds above its head. As to why there was a random Gigantamax Dragonite here, it could be that there was a remote power spot in the middle of the ocean that the Dragonite came upon, triggering Dynamax. Corphish Origins. Corphish, despite being a Gen 3 Pokemon, is not actually from Hoenn. It is said to have been imported from a faraway region for use as pets, which is rather strange. Corphish are based on the real-world crawfish, most of which live in the southeastern United States. So there is probably a region in the Pokemon world based on this real-world location, similar to the hinted India region. Crystal Onyx is a regional. Similar to the Terra theory, this theory states that the infamous Crystal Onyx is in fact just a regional form that wasn't discovered yet. Considering that the Crystal Onyx didn't have a weakness to water but was deterred by fire-type moves, it's likely that this version was a Ice-type. And it makes sense as to why we haven't seen it in the games. It's from the Orange Islands, an anime-only location. Alolan Executor 1997. The cover of a 1997 TCG booster pack featured an Executor that had a really long neck. Of course, this wouldn't have made sense back then since Executor didn't really have a neck, but retroactively this could have been Alolan Executor, infamous for its ridiculously long neck. However, it just makes me wonder if the original design for Executor featured a long neck, or if there was some sort of scrapped evolution that couldn't make it into the game because the long neck prevented it from being depicted in sprite form. And then 20 years later, they were able to finally bring their vision to reality with the Alolan form. It would be a meta-parallel to how in Universe, Alolan and Executor are the true Executor, while the Cantonian version are actually the regional forms, technically, because they were the ones who weren't able to get enough sunlight to grow. Gold Melmetal. In Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, if you take your Melmetal to Cerulean Cave and have it stand near the crystals, it turns gold. While this could be some weird lighting bug, it's a bit strange that it only happens near the crystals, though it's possible that it's a lighting interaction specifically with the light given off by the crystals. In Universe, it's possible the crystals of Cerulean Cave have a reaction with the metal making up Melmetal's body, maybe even purifying it and turning it gold. Perhaps this is where Meltan and Melmetal could have originated, being their true birthplace. I really do hope we get anything concerning these Pokemon in the future. Red Blue Rescue Team Meteor. In Pokemon Red and Blue Rescue Team, one important plot point is a meteor about to hit the planet, which is then destroyed by Rayquaza. Of course, if you played the mainline series game, you would know that this plotline is almost identical to the Delta episode in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, where a meteor about to hit Hoenn is destroyed by Mega Rayquaza. During the Delta episode, the scientists at Moss Deep initially want to prevent the meteor strike by teleporting it to another dimension, implied to be the Hoenn of the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Of course, this doesn't happen, as Zinnia objects to it and the player uses Rayquaza to destroy it instead. However, we do see that a meteor does in fact hit in the non-Mega timeline, presumably on Birth Island in the Sevi Islands, where Deoxys could be found. So either this meteor was original to the non-Mega universe, or there was another Mega timeline where the Moss Deep scientists were successful in teleporting the meteor to the non-Mega timeline. making this assumption that there are multiple mega timelines out there, each with scientists trying to teleport the meteor. It's possible that a few of them were successful and teleported them across the multiverse, with one of them being teleported to the Mystery Dungeon universe. I do wonder if this plot point from Rescue Team ended up inspiring the Delta episode. It's a bit too similar to be coincidence. Curum is a creation dragon. The creation dragons are a Gen 4 legendary trio who represent the states of matter. Dialga, with its secondary steel type, represents solid. Palkia, with its secondary water type, represents liquid, while Giratina, with its secondary ghost type, represents gas. However, there is a fourth major state of matter, which is plasma. The two most well-known examples of plasma are lightning and fire. Well, fire is technically not plasma, depending on who you ask, but it's close enough to the point where there are multiple debates online regarding whether or not plasma is fire, so that's probably good enough for Pokemon. Of course, according to the lore, Curum is simply just the empty husk of the original dragon, which remained after Reshiram and Zekrom were created. So if the original dragon had a combination of Reshiram's fire and Zekrom's lightning, the best way to describe it is as a plasma dragon. And it's possible that a dragon of that power, one which represents a state of matter even, could be on the same level as the creation trio, even being a forgotten fourth member. I mean, it would also explain why the evil team of Gen 5 is called Team Plasma. It seems like a rather oddball name that doesn't really fit the team's goals on the surface, but given that Ghetsis' plans in both Black and White 1 and their sequels involved using the power of both Reshiram and Zekrom, perhaps he knew that when both of them combined into Curum, it would become the Plasma Dragon, and he named the team after that. Oswald scanned fairies. In episode 62 of the anime, a scientist named Oswald has a scanner that supposedly detects aliens. He uses it on two Pokemon, Clefairy and Jigglypuff, and it identifies both as alien. However, it also detects Misty as an alien, so the protagonist read it off as bunk, which it likely was. While the Clefairy do turn out to actually be alien, this doesn't explain why the Jigglypuff, as well as Misty, set off the device. However, what if the device didn't really detect aliens, but rather fairy types? The scanner detected fairies as alien, as fairies were not discovered to be a part of the local ecology at this point in time. Both Clefairy and Jigglypuff are fairies, which were previously classified as pure normal types, so it makes sense as to why the scanner would detect them. But why Misty then? Well, this episode took place after Misty received her Togepi, which is another future fairy type. Perhaps Togepi's fairy type energy lingered on Misty, causing the scanner to go off. Guzma has fake tattoos. After Team Skull disbands, all the members remove the Team Skull iconography from their clothes. But what about their Team Skull tattoos? Well, they apparently just disappeared too. This implies that the tattoos were not actually permanently inked into their skins, but rather just temporary tattoos, like the ones you put a little piece of paper down on your skin, cover it in water, and rub down on it. It's kind of hilarious, and I guess it represents how Team Skull were never truly evil, but just misguided and on the wrong path, and then fixed their ways. While it's pretty common for ordinary people to get tattoos in places like America, in Japan there's still a bit of stigma regarding tattoos, especially among older people, as it used to be that the only people who got them were involved in crime. So it would make sense for Team Skull, who want to put on the appearance of an organized crime group, to get these tattoos. But since they're all good people deep down, the tattoos are fake and not permanent. Psychic weaknesses. Psychic type is a bit of an abstract type, which is reflected in its weakness: bug, ghost, and dark. Initially, there seems to be no common sense reason for this. Like, we can easily understand why water beats fire, but why would an insect beat a dude with telekinesis? Well, this is because psychic's weaknesses are based on common fears of humans. Common fears include the fear of bugs, fear of ghosts, and fear of the dark. Fear is nothing but the brain telling us that we need to get out of there, and we often struggle to face our fears, so it is how you defeat a mind. Some people say this theory doesn't make sense, since there are other common fears like fear of heights, which means psychic should be weak to flying type, and so on. But honestly, bug, dark, and ghost just make the most sense thematically, and of course for game balance reasons. Hassel is Ryuki. In the Hassel Friendship quest, he tells you a bit of his backstory. He says that he ran away from home, wanting to make a living with music. However, it didn't work out, and now he's a teacher and Elite 4 member in Paldea. We've actually seen another Dragon-type trainer with a connection to music before. Ryuki. Ryuki is a character in the Gen 7 games who most notably challenges you with a team of dragon types in the League Champion defense. He talks about how he wants to become a dragon type gym leader. Additionally, one of his lines of dialogue mentions that while critics loved his music, nobody was really buying it. This perfectly lines up with Hassel's story. While he wanted to become a professional musician, that dream fell through because he wasn't able to sell his music. So, he instead focused on becoming a dragon type gym leader, which he was able to eventually do in Paldea. As we saw with Larry, Paldean gym leaders are able to ascend to Elite 4 status, sometimes even holding both titles at the same time. So it could be that Hassel, being a talented dragon type trainer, was able to ascend from gym leader to the Elite 4. And as another job, he took up teaching the arts to students. While in the games, we only ever see him teach visual arts like painting, music is a part of the arts, and it's entirely possible he also teaches a music course that we don't ever see in the game. So yeah, it's actually pretty possible that Hassel used to be a musician using the stage name Ryuki. The only issue here is the timeline. Ryuki seems like a pretty young guy, like teenager or early 20s, while Hassel is quite old, maybe around 40 to 50 years old. There's no set timeline to the Pokemon games, so technically Scarlet and Violet could take place decades after Sun and Moon, but I'm inclined to believe that only 10 or so years passed, analogous to the real-world time passing. Here's why. In the Legends ZA trailer, we see a Rotom phone that's basically identical to the one in Scarlet and Violet, indicating that they take place at the same time. Also, in the Legends ZA promotional material, we see what is clearly an older version of Emma, a character from the original X and Y. Emma is a teenager in X and Y, and she still looks pretty young in the ZA art, maybe 30 at the oldest. This narrows the gap between X and Y and Scarlet and Violet to 15 years max. But what about the gap between X and Y and Sun and Moon? Well, there are characters shared between the two games, Dexio and Cena, who don't seem to age at all between their appearances, maybe 1 to 3 years max. So, this means that it's likely that the time gap between Gen 7 and Gen 9 is around 10 years. If we assume that Ryuki, like many rockers, tried to hang on to their youth, maybe he could be around 30 years in Sun and Moon, which would put him in his early 40s in Scarlet and Violet, and yeah, that's reasonable. The only discrepancy that I can find is that Ryuki is right-handed, while Hassel is left-handed, but maybe he's ambidextrous. Honestly, I'm going to accept this theory as my headcanon going forward. Clara Photoshop. In Clara's lead card, it initially seems like she's just taking a selfie. However, we can see that something is afoot by looking at her Slowbro in the background, which is unnaturally distorted. Usually, you'll see warping and unnatural curving like this on social media posts, where influencers use Photoshop or some filters to change their body image, typically to enhance their curves. If you look at where the distortion is on Clara's card, it becomes clear that she's editing the image to make her chest look bigger. It's a hilarious detail and completely in character for her, since she's a complete narcissist obsessed with how she looks as well as her popularity, but is in reality insecure about herself deep down. She would totally Photoshop herself to make herself seem more attractive by her standards in an attempt to gain more attention. Wonderful detail to include on Game Freak's part, great characterization. Tate, Liza, and Phoebe. This theory states that Tate and Liza are the cousins of the Elite Four member Phoebe. In the manga, they are the grandchildren of the Guardians of Mount Pyre. Additionally, Phoebe is shown to be the granddaughter of a Mount Pyre Guardian. While these are different continuities, they are analogous, so they still could be related in the game canon. Since it's unlikely that they're siblings, they're probably cousins. Gestus is scarred. This is a theory that the entire right side of Gestus' body is scarred. In both of his in-game designs, he hides his right arm in his cloak, and he also has an eye patch over his right eye. We only ever see his right arm once in the opening cutscene of Black and White. We see both of his arms when he is crowning N, and his right arm has a sort of dark discoloration. This doesn't look like a shadow, as his right sleeve on his robe is still bright, meaning that the skin itself is discolored. So it's possible that the entire right side of his body was disfigured, and he usually prefers to hide the deformities. But what could have caused these scars? Well, some people say that his own Hydreigon caused it. As we mentioned in a previous layer, Gestus' Hydreigon has a max-powered frustration in Black and White 2, meaning that it literally has zero happiness and the trainer is constantly mistreating it. Even normal animals lash out when they're being abused, so Hydreigon, a species naturally predisposed to rage and destruction according to its dex entries, would obviously react very violently when being mistreated. Perhaps these scars are from Hydreigon fighting back against Gestas. Another theory is that Gestas attempted to recruit or capture Kyurem in the past, but failed and barely escaped with his life, with half of his body being scarred from the attempt. Not only could it have been from physical attacks, but also from frostbite caused by Kyurem's ice-type attacks. Severe frostbite can cause your skin to turn a coal-like black, which is exactly the color Gestas' scarred arm was. Gengar and Nidorino trainers. In the original opening cutscene of Pokemon Red and Blue, we can see a Gengar and Nidorino fight. This is actually a pretty iconic matchup, and it has been referenced a bunch of times since then. But who are the trainers of these two Pokemon? Well, evidence points to it being Agatha and Oak, perhaps even a younger version of those characters from back when they were rivals. Of course, Agatha's ace is a Gengar, so that is self-explanatory. But what about Oak and Nidorino? Well, in the original games, when Oak is giving you that initial explanation of what a Pokemon is, he throws out a Nidorino. And if you wanted any more confirmation, in Pokemon Masters, Oak and Nidorino are a special sync pair, and they even reference the original Gengar and Nidorino battle in Masters. Now with the trainers, Agatha and Oak, standing behind their respective Pokemon. Theory proven. Pocket Monsters, the animation. This is a series of 2 light novels written by Takeshi Shudo, the head writer for the first 2 seasons of the anime, and they are meant to be a novelization of the early anime. We've already talked about Takeshi Shudo on earlier layers of the Iceberg, as there was an entry claiming that Professor Ivy was a lesbian, supposedly stated in these very books. However, this is not true, as this claim was in fact misinformation spread around by some internet users. He was also mentioned to scrap the original plan for Movie 3, with it exploring real-world animals going extinct in the Pokemon world. There are still many interesting insights into the initial vision for Pokemon, at least through the eyes of Shudo, that we can find through these books. And most of it is pretty strange and oddly depressing, so let's go through some of these weird details. The Kanto of Pocket Monsters, the animation, is not the whimsical, optimistic world we are used to. Pallet Town is no longer an idyllic, picturesque village, but rather a downtrodden, impoverished flyover town. Basically one of those American rural factory towns that are barely surviving now after the factory shut down. The only thing to do in Pallet Town that's worth your time is figuring out a way to get out. However, due to the horrific economic conditions of the region as a whole, your prospects are slim. Traditional jobs are few and far between, and education is not a reliable way to increase your skill set, as education for children is very basic, ending when they are 10 years old. Also, 10 is supposedly the age when people in the Pokemon world become adults. So 10 is when they are meant to move out, when the legal system will charge them with adult crimes, and most disturbingly is also the age of consent in Kanto, meaning child marriages are rampant in the region. Not sure why Shudo needed to include that detail, but whatever. Due to the lack of education and prospects, the one profession many young children pursue is that of a Pokemon trainer, essentially their world's versions of sports celebrities. But like the real world, actually making it as a trainer is extremely difficult, meaning the region is filled with many teens and young adults who burned out or otherwise couldn't make it as a trainer, perpetuating the unemployment and homelessness epidemic. Ash's father was supposedly one of these people. He got Dahlia pregnant while she was a teenager and left her to raise Ash on her own. Dahlia told Ash that his dad was a great trainer on his journey as a comforting lie, but in reality he's just a deadbeat. Dahlia was actually kind of relieved that Ash left home at 10 years old, as she secretly loathed the responsibility of raising a child, and would prefer to not have that responsibility anymore. She often tries to reclaim what she thinks was her lost youth, through actions such as wearing a miniskirt despite being an unexpected fashion choice for a woman for her age. One of the few jobs which provide stability are gym leaders. However, due to large competition for the small number of gym leader positions, if a gym leader loses 3 times, they lose their position. Just goes to show you how cutthroat the region is. Other details include the fact that all Officer Jennys are just members of one family, Jenny being a surname, meaning that the entire region's law enforcement is under the control of a single family. Additionally, Pikachu apparently cannot evolve into Raichu, since Pikachu who evolved too early can't handle the electricity increase when becoming a Raichu, constantly electrocuting themselves to the point of death or immense trauma that blocks them from trying to ever even use electricity again. So yeah, a pretty strange original canon. Honestly, considering that some details are disproven later in the series, it's pretty clear that this isn't canon anymore, and more like a headcanon beta plan for the Pokemon world. At points, it really just does read like an edgy headcanon. While some details are a bit strange, I think the idea of an economically stagnant region, with Pokemon training being the only viable way to escape poverty, could be an interesting backdrop for a game story, maybe even a Legends game. Kyogre killed Archie and Shelly. Episode 8 of Pokemon Generations, titled The Cavern, retells the story of Kyogre's awakening from the Alpha Sapphire game. The episode ends with Archie regretting his decision to awake Kyogre and chasing after it in the sub. Then he starts to plead with Kyogre to obey him. Of course, Kyogre doesn't, and the episode ends on a freeze frame of Kyogre about to attack the sub, with Archie and Shelly cowering. Of course, this likely means that they both died here. I honestly don't see a way they're coming out of this one. Though they honestly deserve it, this episode only highlights how dumb Team Aqua and Magma's plan was. Like 2 minutes ago, he literally told Kyogre to go destroy everything, and that is a quote. And then he sees that Kyogre is destroying everything, and just goes, "Oh no, Kyogre, stop." Similarly, the previous episode of Generations, Division, shows us Maxie getting killed, with Groudon supposedly melting him and a good chunk of Team Magma in what appears to be a Fire-type attack. Once again, victims of their own stupidity, but it's nice to see these team leaders immediately get destroyed by powers they thought they could control for their own ideologies. However, since they don't die in the games, which Generation is supposed to be canon to, I guess they could have miraculously survived. Sun and Moon Demo Ghost Girl. One of the more obscure Ghost Girls of the Pokemon games, this one being exclusive to the Sun and Moon demo. In the demo, there's a short dialogue in the marina where you can talk to a girl who tells you she's afraid of boats, but still has to go see her parents. She asks you to see her off, and now confident that you're watching her back, she goes to board the ship. However, before she reaches the ticketing desk, a Machamp passes in front of her and she disappears, as if she never existed. Now, there are a few explanations to this. Some people said that this could actually be a reference to Green's character in the Fire Red and Leaf Green arc of the manga, who gets on a boat to meet her parents but then is attacked by Deoxys and falls into a coma. Leaf, the game counterpart of Green, was notably absent in Sun and Moon, even though an older Red and Blue showed up, so perhaps this one weird demo mission was actually a nod to where she was during the events of Sun and Moon. If we look at the ghost theory instead, it's possible that she was just a random girl who died in a shipwreck alongside her parents, and now her ghost is deathly afraid of boats. However, in order to go to the afterlife, she needs to get on a boat, as is the case in some afterlife beliefs. So the player reassuring her that it's okay basically allows her spirit to pass on in peace, finally able to meet her parents in the afterlife. This is the story theory which I believe. However, it's entirely possible that this was just meant to be taken at face value. Game Freak simply didn't want to create a special animation for her passing through the gate and getting on the boat, so they just have her disappear behind a Machamp as a lazy shorthand. This is what's most likely. If you're enjoying this Pokemon content so far and want more, you guys should check out my second channel, Rev Extra, which has a bunch of shorter, more typical Pokemon videos. It's not an exclusive Pokemon channel though, but it seems like right now that's what most of it is. Right now, the most recent upload is a video where I remake the teams for each champion, not necessarily to make them more competitive like many other Fixing Teams videos, but rather change some members to fit more with the lore and personality of each champion. If that sounds interesting to you, you should check it out after finishing this video. Link is in the description. Gen 2 Cantonian Pokemon. Houndour, Murkrow, and Slugma, despite being Generation 2 Pokemon, are only found in the wild within Kanto. This has led some to theorize that they are actually native to Kanto, not Johto. But why didn't these Pokemon appear in Kanto during the Generation 1 games? There are a bunch of fun explanations. One applies to Murkrow and Houndour. Both of them are only available in the nighttime, a feature introduced with Generation 2's day and night cycle. However, the Generation 1 games didn't have a day and night cycle, so it can be assumed that the adventure only takes place during the day, with the player sleeping off screen at night. So they didn't even have a chance to find Houndour and Murkrow since they were always inside sleeping when those Pokemon came out. But what about Slugma? Well, they could have appeared due to an environmental change. Between the Gen 1 and 2 games, the volcano on Cinnabar Island erupted. So either the new abundance of lava in the area attracted the Slugma, or the Slugma were literally living in the volcano, and the eruption launched them everywhere, with some landing in the south of mainland Kanto where they are found today. Additionally, it could be possible that these Pokemon have a habit of seasonal migration. Maybe the Gen 1 games took place in a time of year where these Pokemon are elsewhere, while the Gen 2 games took place in a time of year where these Pokemon have migrated to Kanto. Kind of like how Canadian geese are only found in northern Canada in the summer and in the southern US in the winter due to their migration patterns. Relicanth is the perfect life form. Relicanth's Pokédex entries emphasize the fact that it has remained unchanged for over 100 million years. If it was able to survive that long without needing to evolve in the Darwinian sense, it would mean that it's literally perfect for its environment and does not need to change at all, as any genetic mutations would make it actively worse off. This means that Relicanth is the perfect life form, at least for its environment. If it lived somewhere where there was even one grass-type Pokemon, Relicanth would not be surviving. Channelers are possessed. This is more of an overlooked fact than a theory, but basically channelers are a trainer class in Pokemon, typically only in the earlier generations, which allow ghosts to possess them. This is explicitly stated, as in some cases after you beat a channeler, they apologize to you, saying that they were possessed. However, who exactly is possessing them? One would say the Ghastly line, however, they are never shown to actually have the power to possess people. Considering that in some languages they are called mediums, it is possible they actually act as vessels for actual human ghosts who try to communicate with the mortal world. Mega Flygon designs. Game Freak have stated that they were working on adding Mega Flygon in Generation 6. However, they faced artist's block while doing so and dropped it from consideration. Flygon is a fan favorite Pokemon, and many people were and still are awaiting a Mega Evolution for it and are mad that it didn't get one. The theories that come from this are twofold. First, if they were at least working on a Mega Flygon design, there are probably, at the bare minimum, some sketches or concept art of a potential Mega Flygon that we have yet to see. Unfortunately, these were not found in the Terra leak that happened recently, where a bunch of Game Freak's internal documents got leaked and we saw a bunch of scrapped and beta designs for Pokemon. While the Terra leak did show us betas for some Generation 6 Pokemon and Megas, including concept art for a completely scrapped Mega Jinx, Mega Flygon was not referenced at all. However, the Terra leak may offer another perspective on why Mega Flygon was never released. You see, I never really bought the artist block explanation. Like, to be honest, the bar for a Mega design is really low. Mega Sharpedo and Mega Aerodactyl are not exactly groundbreaking designs. So, the fact that they'd go through multiple iterations of Mega Flygon and decide that all of them were not good enough to make it in the game doesn't add up. However, there's another seemingly unrelated fact in the Terra leak. There was initially supposed to be a flying type evolution in Sun and Moon, but it was scrapped as the designs were too similar to fan-made designs. With Mega Flygon also being a highly anticipated Pokemon, it's entirely likely that as soon as Megas were announced for X and Y, Mega Flygon fan art was flooding the internet. And Game Freak's art block was not because they couldn't figure out a good design for Mega Flygon, but rather they couldn't come up with a design that was distinct enough from the boatload of fan-made designs being posted to the internet. Honestly, once I read that Game Freak scraps Pokemon too similar to fan-made designs, every time I see a really cool fake Pokemon design online, I get a little sad because it means that the Pokemon design or something similar may never get added to the game. Eternal Flower Floette event. A reminder that this Iceberg was made before Legends ZA was announced, because now of course we know that there will be an Eternal Flower Floette made available in Legends ZA. They'll probably do the same thing as Enamorus in Legends Arceus. Since both AZ and Floette are immortal, AZ will be like, yeah, you can take Floette, I'll pick her up in like 80 years when you die. However, this theory is regarding how the AZ Floette was supposed to initially be distributed, as the code for the Pokemon was included in the Gen 6 and 7 games alongside an exclusive move. However, I don't think it was anything special. Most distributions during that time period were just done through GameStop codes for mystery gifts, so it's likely that they would have done the same for AZ's Floette, which is pretty lame. Say what you want about Scarlet and Violet, one thing that they did correctly was giving us an entire hour-long epilogue to the overarching story that also served as an entire event to catch Pecharunt. If mythical distributions in the future are similar to how they were in Legends Arceus and Scarlet and Violet, it is 100% a step in the right direction compared to older entries in the series. Wigglytuff is evil. Even as a kid, I thought that Wigglytuff in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon 2 was super suspicious. Wigglytuff is the leader of your guild in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon 2, and on the surface, he seems to be an aloof incompetent, and unserious character. However, there's a bit of a dark side to him, since his personality could just be a front, and he does have a short temper, berates the guild members, and will get so scary if he doesn't get his perfect apples to the point of guild members actively fearing the occasion. He has a history of, and still is, a legendary explorer, despite seemingly being a complete idiot. Additionally, the way the guild is set up, the explorers only get 10% of the reward money, while the rest presumably goes towards guild leadership such as Wigglytuff. And there are a couple other strange details, such as the fact that Wigglytuff's idol and mentor when he was a young Igglybuff was an outlaw Armaldo. Additionally, while doing a test for the player to graduate from the guild, he basically calls himself the Grand Master of all things bad. And while he was playing a character, it is still an odd choice. The creator of the Iceberg said that they think that Wigglytuff within the story seemed to coincidentally be at the right place at the right time too often, and that he actually was a mastermind, at least partially, of a lot of the events in the game. However, I don't think that this is the case. I think that he's an incredibly shady and partially insane character, running a guild unethically, but not someone who's straight up evil and a mastermind of everything in the game. Rotom Dex is unreliable.
That Pokemon!
Let's find out!
Drenna, the bike Pokemon, a water and rock type, and I don't know.
While we've always talked about how Pokédex entries were wild and unreliable in this Iceberg, we have to pay special attention to the entries in Generation 7. For some reason, the blurbs in the Alolan Pokédex are absolutely insane, being a lot darker and brutal than prior entries. Now, there are a couple of reasons as to why this could be the case. First is the fact that previously Dex entries were either written by the young trainers themselves or by the professors for children, so it's possible that they were toned down content-wise, either through the innocent eyes of a child or due to the professors toning it down. However, once Rotom got put in charge of making Dex entries, it didn't have any such restriction and would just factually state information regarding the Pokemon, regarding how traumatic it would be for a child. So basically, it's too reliable regarding Pokemon. The other explanation, based on how Rotom Dex had a sassy, sarcastic personality in the Gen 7 games, is that it's just straight up lying to you, making up these ridiculous Dex entries to troll the player. This could be a side effect of the Gen 7 Rotom Dex being the first iteration of Dexes with Rotoms, or the fact that your Rotom specifically had a prankster personality. Especially in the Ultra games, while some people did say it was a bit annoying, I always enjoyed his dialogue because sometimes he would just be saying some insane shit, like it's clear that this Rotom specifically is very eccentric. In the later games, which include devices like Rotom phones that have no discernible personality, they could have toned down Dex entries because later iterations of the Rotom operating system toned them down, or had Rotoms which weren't trolls in them. Garchomp's home region. Gibble's Dex entries state that it is not native to Sinnoh, but rather a climate much warmer than it. This makes sense, since it would hate the cold due to being weak to ice, and its Pearl Dex entry does state that it's initially from the tropics. Obviously, tropics makes you immediately think of Alola. However, in its Ultramoon Dex entry, it says that Gibble was initially from a region much hotter than Alola. So from the regions we already know, the most fitting answer is Hoenn. Hoenn is a tropical region, and Gibble's Dex entries talk about how it likes to live in geothermal vents. Well, Hoenn is a lot hotter than Alola, not only due to the more tropical climate, but also having a desert, no significant ice biomes like other regions, and due to the fact that it is home to a massive volcano in Mount Chimney, which is why the region as a whole has a lot of geothermal activity. Additionally, if you remember the theory regarding Sharpedo and Garchomp being related, if the two did have a common ancestor, it would have been in Hoenn. So it's possible that the Gibble line initially did live in Hoenn, maybe in or around Mount Chimney, before moving to other regions, perhaps for ecological reasons such as needing food. Sinjoh is a pocket dimension. In the Pokemon Adventures manga, Sinjoh is actually a small pocket dimension with portals to both Sinnoh and Johto. Considering that little is known about Sinjoh in the games, it's possible that this is also the case in the games. However, the town map while we're in Sinjoh seems to imply that we're north of Johto, which makes geographical sense, and honestly there's no reason for Sinjoh not just to be a regular location. Solgaleo in Movie 3. In the third Pokemon movie, a character is reading a book about a legendary Pokemon. One page features a visualization of this legendary, which is depicted as a sun shining down on a tropical beach. Well, not only do we have a legendary Pokemon which represents the sun, but it is also in a tropical region, Solgaleo. and honestly they do match up looks-wise. The sun creature in the image could feasibly be an artist's rendition of Solgaleo. Someone looking at Solgaleo head-on would see a face with two eyes as well as its mane looking like the sun. Additionally, the legendary in the book has a dot in between its eyes, which also matches Solgaleo. While obviously Solgaleo wasn't planned back then when movie 3 released, I do wonder if they did take some basic inspiration from the movie when planning the Hawaii-based Pokemon Sun and Moon. Mandibuzz Bones. The Mandibuzz line wears Bones as clothes, with Vullaby using them as a sort of diaper, while Mandibuzz wears them as a skirt and hairpin. Well, if you actually put the bones together, you can see that it forms a human-like skull, with Vullaby's bone being the top half of the skull, while Mandibuzz's skirt is the lower jaw and teeth of the skull. While the teeth are a bit too sharp to be human, it's possible that they became this shape after being worn down over time, or it also could just be one of the many human-like Pokemon, such as Sock or Throw. Ruby meant to have Jirachi. The Pokemon Adventures Ruby and Sapphire arc, Ruby used a team of 5 for most of the run, even though he had a 6th Pokemon which he never took out. Keep in mind this was never really explicitly paid attention to, nobody really asks him, oh hey, what's that mysterious 6th Pokemon? It's just never brought up to the end. However, in literally the final chapter of the story, he reveals that his 6th Pokemon is a Celebi, which is able to not only defeat Archie and Maxie, but also brings back all of Ruby's allies who died in the battle. This is considered one of the worst endings of any arc in the series, since it's all resolved by a literal deus ex machina. Additionally, it's unknown why Celebi joined up with Ruby. While the character did move from Johto to Hoenn before the events of the story, he didn't purposefully catch it. It rather just joined willingly and he never mentioned it. This is also considered egregious since Celebi does appear in the Gold and Silver arc, where one of its defining traits is that it's elusive and extremely difficult to contain, with people trying for years and needing the special GS ball to do so. So just having it be in a regular Pokeball for Ruby was a bit cheap, even if it is implied that Celebi joined him willingly. However, there is a theory that initially Ruby's 6th Pokemon was not Celebi, but rather Jirachi. Now don't get me wrong, if Jirachi replaced Celebi, the writing here would still be horrendous. However, Jirachi does fit nicely. First of all, it's Hoenn's mythical, so it makes more sense to feature it in the Hoenn arc over Celebi, a Johto Pokemon. Since Jirachi is the wish-granting Pokemon, it would have the power to do what Celebi did, as Ruby would just need to wish to defeat Archie and Maxie, and then wish to bring everyone who died back to life. And since Jirachi didn't have any previous storylines, it wouldn't be as bad to introduce it, rather than bringing back Celebi. However, maybe the authors had the opposite reasoning as to me, that they didn't just want to bring a random Pokemon in for the finale, but one which readers would already be attached to. Additionally, some people say that since Celebi was previously established to be so hard to obtain, the fact that Ruby was worthy enough to command one was a hype reveal, even though it wasn't really foreshadowed. But then again, Pokemon Adventures is not exactly intended to be the bastion of good consistent writing, but rather a fun canvas for some authors to write and draw stories about Pokemon. Mecha Mewtwo. Mecha Mewtwo is a robotic Pokemon created by Giovanni in the Pokemon Live musical. It is said to be the most powerful being in all existence, being able to not only learn any moves, but also use it with amplified power. Giovanni plans to use it to conquer the world, and it's seemingly unstoppable until regular Mewtwo shows up and attacks it with the psychic attack of Love. With Mecha Mewtwo now understanding Love, it realizes what it's doing is wrong, and grabs onto Giovanni and uses self-destruct. While Giovanni is able to escape and live, Mecha Mewtwo is destroyed. So the theory here is that it's unknown how Giovanni created this thing, whether it's even considered a Pokemon, and a bunch of the finer lore details regarding it. But let's be honest, this was never meant to be thought about in any capacity beyond it's an evil, powerful bad guy. Like, this play was running back in 2000 and 2001, which was when even Game Freak didn't even have a concrete idea of what they wanted Pokemon to be. So some playwrights who only had a basic gist of the anime would not really care about lore or continuity. Like, this play isn't even canon to the anime, it's an entirely standalone thing. However, I will say it would have been really cool if one of the special enemies in Black and White 2's Pokestar Studios was Mecha Mewtwo. The cheesy action movies you're making in Pokestar Studios are exactly like Pokemon Live, and the design of Mecha Mewtwo would fit perfectly with the weird movie monsters you fight in Pokestar Studios. Volcanion is man-made. Very self-explanatory, Volcanion may be a man-made Pokemon. Design-wise, while it is animalistic, it also has artificial elements which could indicate that it was created by humans. Additionally, in one of the anime movies, it has special knowledge and ties to Magearna, another man-made mythical. so it's possible that Nicola, the person who created Magirna, also built Volcanion. Additionally, Volcanion in the movie needs to refill its water manually, which is weird because most water types just have the ability to create water, so this is another supporting piece of evidence for it being artificial. Mount Silver Forest. In the original build of Gold and Silver, as seen in the Space World demo, it seems like there was a forest in the area right before the entrance to Mount Silver. It also looks like Mount Silver was right above your starting town, which, fun fact, was called Silent Hill. But yeah, not only was Mount Silver's location changed, which I guess is reasonable considering the entire map was hugely changed and shrunk in scope, but the forest area was removed, which is less explainable. The final game still has an area for the entrance of Mount Silver, but no forest. While this could have just been a random change, a far-out conspiracy says that it was removed because it was based on the Aokigahara forest. Well, it makes sense that the town right next to it would be called Silent Hill, because Aokigahara forest land, being made out of porous volcanic rock, makes the dense forest absorb sound very well, creating a sense of silence and solitude. Possibly due to this, the forest has a mythical reputation for being a home of ghosts. However, it has sadly gained another reputation for being a place where people go to take their own lives, to the point where entrances to the forest urge any people visiting to seek help if they are having suicidal thoughts. Yes, this is the same forest where Logan Paul shamelessly filmed his video of a dead body. Well, the reputation had already existed at the time of Gold and Silver's development, and it's possible that some Game Freak employees realized that while the forest's mythical reputation could have made it a nice in-game location to pick up ghost-type Pokemon, its more depressing reputation would have made it insensitive to depict it as a place where you can catch ghosts, especially since some Pokedex entries imply that ghost Pokemon are dead humans. So this is why they changed it, though this could also be why Misdreavus is still only found in Mount Silver in the final game. Honestly, the original Gold and Silver map looks super interesting. It's based on the entirety of Japan rather than just one part of the region. If you look closely, you can see that the entirety of Kanto has just been shrunk down to one city. This of course was due to the fact that they thought Gen 2 would be the last game. So they made a map representing all of Japan to provide a sense of finality and grandeur. But once they realized they were going to be making more Pokemon, they narrowed the scope of the map to be the area right next to Kanto. While some elements of the original made it into the final Johto game, there were some really cool areas and landmarks that were scrapped, which is sad. Duel Lost Island Hotels. Pokemon Duel is a weird mobile game released in 2016. The game takes place on an island with a tournament of 9 hotels, each with a hotel boss owner. However, only 6 of the owners are known, as the development for the game ended before it could be fully finished. This means that the bosses of the 7th through 9th hotels, titled the Labyrinth, La Galleria Luna, and the Blue Planet, will never be known, even though somewhere deep in Pokemon's offices they have the files for them. Abandoned media like this makes me feel kind of sad. Sure, I've never heard this game before researching this entry, but clearly there were some people who had fun playing it and miss it. There's actually a Pokemon Duel subreddit with over 13,000 members, yet it's obviously dead now. One of the most recent posts is of someone saying that they had a dream where the game was going to be brought back with the next Pokemon Presents, and all the comments were saying that they all shared that dream. That's how you know a fandom is in a really bad state. Volcanion in Johto and Sinnoh. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire's TV Marvel, a broadcast states that Brandon has left to explore Kalos, Sinnoh, and Johto in search of Volcanion. Volcanion is a Kalos native Pokemon, so looking there makes sense. But Johto and Sinnoh are kind of out of left field, as Volcanion has never been implied to live in those regions at all. I guess with Sinnoh you have the Fuego Ironworks, which is a pretty fitting place for a Volcanion, but Johto really doesn't have an equivalent. However, some dex entries state that Volcanion does live in mountainous areas, and Johto is pretty mountainous, so I guess that's the reasoning for looking there. Pikachu leaving anime. If you're this far down the iceberg, you definitely know about episode 38 of the anime Electric Soldier Porygon, which caused adverse health effects like seizures in many people who watched its initial broadcast, due to the flashing strobe lights in the episode. The widespread reports of seizures as well as subsequent backlash caused the anime to go on a 4-month hiatus, and once it came back, Porygon, as well as its future evolutions, would never be featured in the game again, besides some minor background cameos. However, many people would object to the Porygon line's exclusion from the anime, as in the actual episode it wasn't Porygon who was responsible for the epilepsy-inducing flashing, but rather Pikachu. Even Pokemon themselves tweeted in 2020 that Porygon did nothing wrong, clearly referring to the fact that it was a scapegoat for something that Pikachu was responsible for. But obviously you couldn't just remove Pikachu, the mascot of the franchise and core of the anime, from the show, right? Or did they? You see, after the 4-month hiatus, the first episode to air was Pikachu's Goodbye. This episode was not actually a part of the initial schedule for anime episodes, meaning it was not planned and was created during the 4-month hiatus after Electric Soldier Porygon. The episode's plot revolves around Ash's Pikachu finding a group of wild Pikachu and running away to be with them. While Ash initially searches for his Pikachu, he sadly accepts that Pikachu will likely be happier living with other Pikachu and abandons the search. However, his Pikachu runs back to him and the two have an emotional reunion. The theory states that there could have been some secret audience testing that ended the anime episode early, so that Pikachu does never come back, to see how kids would react to Pikachu truly leaving Ash. After all, the episode's title is similar to that of Bye Bye Butterfrees, which does have an emotional and permanent goodbye between Ash and Butterfree. Additionally, this episode aired as a 1-hour special alongside episode 40, The Battling Eevee Brothers, which begins with Ash and friends finding an Eevee tied up to a tree, which they presume is abandoned, with Ash also wanting to catch the Eevee before it's pointed out that it already has an owner. This makes me think that if they did go ahead with Pikachu leaving Ash in episode 39, then episode 40 would have began with Ash catching an Eevee to be his new partner Pokemon. After all, Eevee, as we said before, is one of the few Pokemon that can perfectly fill in Pikachu's role as the franchise's mascot. In fact, a lot of people, including me, think that it's actually a better fit to be the mascot of Pokemon over Pikachu. So, Ash having a non-evolving Eevee as his partner would be a good substitute. However, they did go ahead with keeping Pikachu, and they probably scrapped the potential plot of Ash getting an Eevee. The only thing that disproves this theory, really, is the fact that Pokemon would be willing to abandon Pikachu as a mascot. At that point, Pokemon was already incredibly popular, with Pikachu being an iconic character worldwide, so getting rid of it and replacing it with Eevee would be an incredibly risky move. Some people say that episode 39 being added had some other ulterior motives, such as acting as a soft reintroduction to the series, and Ash's and Pikachu's bond after the hiatus, or being an emotional feel-good story so that any parents watching the anime after hearing about the controversy would be extra convinced that it's a good show for their children. I think this is more likely. Guzma was a golfer. A more tame theory regarding the bent golf clubs in Guzma's house is that he was a golfer. While he tried to get good, he would often fail to be the best, which is why he bent his clubs in anger. The bronze and silver trophies in his room are from golf tournaments which he got close to winning but lost, likely to Kahili. There's a bit of a meta-irony here. Guzma being a bug-type trainer would of course lose to the flying-type trainer Kahili, and also naturally be at a disadvantage at golf since he would not be able to get all the golf scores named after birds like birdie, eagle, and albatross. Additionally, Guzma and Kahili have similar poses during battle. Honestly, I can see that there could have been a connection between the two, since Guzma has an obvious connection with golfing, and Kahili being a prominent character that is entirely about golfing. I think that it's possible that alongside just playing golf, the two were rivals when they underwent the island trial as children. Obviously, Kahili was a winner between the two, as she not only had the type advantage, but also Kahili was a good enough trainer to have Kukui approach her to be an Elite Four member. High praise considering that the other Elite Four members were either kahunas or trial captains. So Kahili likely succeeded in her island trial while Guzma failed. Evil Mew. The story in the original Japanese version of Movie 1 was quite different. Here, Mew is not necessarily a benevolent and kind being who preaches peace and love, but rather shows up to destroy all the cloned Pokemon as it believes they're an abomination and not true Pokemon. Of course, this was supposed to be a reflection of how Mewtwo felt that cloned Pokemon were superior. Though in the Japanese version of the movie, Mewtwo was less outright evil and more of a tragic, misguided character, the movie ended with both Mewtwo and Mew realizing that their respective ideologies were wrong, and learning to coexist with each other with the help of the human characters. I guess when dubbing it to English, they made it a lot more morally black and white because I guess they thought American kids couldn't handle more nuanced conflicts. But even though the idea of a sinister Mew is interesting, I'm not sure it would be the best way to handle the conflict in the story. The idea that something as cute and innocent looking as Mew was harboring murderous intentions just seems wrong to me. Jenny and Joy are uniforms. Pretty simple theory here. It's that instead of Officer Jenny and Nurse Joy's all being some weird clones or sisters, it's just that the name and hair are also part of the uniform for being an officer or nurse respectively. Like, if you wanted to become a nurse in the Pokemon universe, you not only have to wear the clothes, but also the pink wig, as well as to take the name Joy on the job. It may seem weird to us, but since the Pokemon world would have a different culture, it could make sense in universe. How's father? I swear, half the theories in this iceberg are speculation about characters' fathers. How's father is also never shown in the games, but we do know he's somewhere near Kanto because he was tired of living in his father, Hala's, shadow. So many people believe that How's father is Bruno, the fighting type Elite Four member of the Kanto region. Unlike other candidates, he could feasibly fit the age range for being How's dad while not having any other aspects about them which would disqualify them. While Chuck from Johto has a greater visual similarity to both Hala and How and lives close enough to Kanto, Chuck has a wife, so in order for him to be How's dad, he either previously divorced How's mom or has a second family that he keeps secret from his family in Alola. Team Rocket created Coughing. Coughing and Wheezing are interesting Pokemon. While they represent pollution of the air, they seem to have been deliberately designed and created by humans due to the crossbones symbol they have. But who could have created them? And why would anyone want to make anything like Wheezing? Well, let's say that they weren't trying to create Coughing, but rather create an artificial clone of Gengar. You see, Team Rocket would have loved to get their hands on the Ghastly line. Not only is it powerful and rare, but ghosts are also the perfect Pokemon for thieves, being able to pass through walls and turn invisible. However, in the world Generation 1 set up, it's implied that ghost Pokemon are incredibly difficult to use or even find. We only see one powerful trainer use ghosts, Agatha, and it's implied the only way you can use them is either by being a channeler and letting them possess you, or using the Self Scope to actually be able to see them. This is why Team Rocket tried to go for the Self Scope. However, even before then, they realized that if you couldn't catch them, why not just make your own that you can mass produce? So Team Rocket scientists got to work. They knew that Ghastly was basically just a floating ball of poisonous gas, so they made their own, Coughing, though it was lacking the ghost type. The scientists also added the skull and bone symbol as a visual warning of its toxicity. Next up, they tried to make even more powerful Coughing to rival Gengar by combining multiple Coughing. But what they ended up with was Wheezing, a horrific body horror abomination of multiple Coughing stuck together in agony. With the project a failure, they scrapped it and left the Coughing. In the Gen 1 games, the only place you can find Coughing is the Pokemon Mansion, where we know that people were doing the genetic experiments to clone Mew. So it makes sense that people may have also been doing genetic experiments to clone Ghastly as well, and the failure of this project being Coughing and Wheezing would have been left to roam the halls of the mansion. This theory is actually pretty good, especially considering the time when I first saw it being posted 10 years ago. However, nowadays with the release of Sword and Shield and Galarian Wheezing, this theory is disproved. Sword and Shield's Dex entry states that Galarian Wheezing came about during the Industrial Revolution to counteract the pollution caused by factories, which means that Coughing existed for at least 100 years. In fact, in Legends Arceus, the Galaxy Team headquarters has a depiction of Galarian Wheezing on their chimney, meaning that the Coughing line definitely predates modern Team Rocket. Trainer's Choice never played Pokemon.
Trainers, which one of these Pokemon evolves into Seviper? Okay, trainers, if you chose Arbok, you were right. Arbok!
Pokemon Trainer's Choice is a little bumper that plays between breaks of the anime, which asks questions about Pokemon, typically regarding type matchups, giving viewers 3 Pokemon and asking them which would be the best in a fight against a given Pokemon. However, people have noticed that the answers they would give for these questions were often just straight up wrong, or the question being proposed had 2 correct answers. The most infamous example of how incorrect Trainer's Choice questions was the clip I showed you in the beginning of the entry, asking which Pokemon evolved into Seviper. Well, the question itself is flawed because Seviper is a single-stage Pokemon. It doesn't evolve from anything else at all. One of my favorite examples of a Trainer's Choice question is this one, where they ask which Pokemon is the best to fight Tyrogue. They answer Exploud, which is not true because Exploud's normal type is weak to Tyrogue's fighting type. Also, for some reason they call Celio Nuzleaf. Here's another incorrect answer. They ask which Pokemon is best to fight Meditites. They answered Combuskin, which once again is incorrect because Combuskin's fighting type is weak to Meditite's psychic type. The correct answer here is Beautifly, whose bug flying type beats both of Meditite's types. Oh wait, but the anime tells me that's Nuzleaf. Seriously, what's with these guys in Nuzleaf? Another interesting question is this one, where they ask which Pokemon is the best against Kirlia, which they answer with Combuskin. Of course, this is once again false due to the second type of Kirlia. But there isn't even a correct answer. None of the other choices are super effective against Kirlia. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There are a bunch of videos on YouTube going over all these mistakes and pointing out all the errors in these questions and answers. So what's going on here? Why is the Pokemon anime broadcasting blatantly false information about Pokemon? Well, the simple answer is that the people behind Trainer's Choice just never played Pokemon or even bothered to look into it. Trainer's Choice was a dub-only addition to the anime, meaning that 4Kids was in charge of it rather than anybody working directly under Pokemon, which meant that it's likely that some employee who never actually interacted meaningfully with Pokemon was put in charge of creating some questions for these bumper segments. And rather than actually doing research and making sure the questions and answers were correct, they just went off of personal intuition, and nobody during the entire production process bothered to fact check them. With this in mind, some of these errors start to make sense. For example, someone who doesn't know about Pokemon may assume that the purple poison type snake would evolve into a crazier, more powerful looking poison snake. Or they also assume that Combuskin was a flying type due to being a bird, and thus would be powerful against Meditite. And since Kirlia is green, maybe it was a grass type. Other questions from Trainer's Choice seem to back this assumption that 4Kids thought that the Gardevoir line was a grass type. And so Combuskin's fire typing would be good against it, though I'm not sure why they still keep calling Pokemon Nuzleaf. People don't read past Red Chapter. Another real-world conspiracy, this states that a lot of people, especially YouTubers who talk about the Adventures manga, never read or even bother to research anything past the initial arc for Pokemon Red. They all just mention Arbok being cut in half, the zombie Psyduck, and maybe touch on how some of the gym leaders, as well as the Elite Four, are evil and working with Team Rocket. However, anything beyond that is usually never mentioned. This was pretty common around a decade ago, when a bunch of PokeTubers were doing short commentary content, and almost all of them would inevitably make a video titled something like The Darkest Things in Pokemon, and then talk about small parts of the first manga arc and call it a day. This doesn't happen a lot anymore, and there are a lot of people who just read the whole thing, or at the very least watch YouTubers like Vvolt or Hybrid Hero who recap manga arcs, or talk about the manga in general. Rose evaded police. In the games, Chairman Rose turned himself into the authorities after the whole Eternatus debacle. However, in the anime, he doesn't turn himself in, but rather escapes. In episode 132 of Journeys, the one where Ash becomes world champion, in a single shot, if you look closely, you can see that two people who bear a strong resemblance to Olina and Rose are watching the stadium from outside. This means that they never got apprehended by the police, but rather escaped the police and are on the run. Or, since Rose is a rich CEO, perhaps the police didn't even bother arresting him and he got off with a slap on the wrist. With that, layer 6 of the Pokemon Conspiracies Iceberg is over. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, and subscribe so you can be informed when the next part is up. If you'd like to support me further, please consider joining my Patreon or becoming a channel member. But as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you guys soon.